June 1944, Normandy. The hedgerows were killing fields, and the Americans were dying in them. D-Day had succeeded. The beaches had been secured, but somewhere inland, the German war machine had found its footing. They had pulled back from the coast, consolidated their defenses, and transformed the French countryside into a sniper's paradise. Every barn loft became a killing position. Every church steeple became a watchtower. Every shattered farmhouse window became the barrel of a rifle aimed at American officers trying to lead their men forward. The advance had stalled, not because the Americans lacked courage, but because the Germans had transformed the landscape itself into a weapon. 23 American officers died in 48 hours trying to cross a single open field outside Carentan. 23 men who followed doctrine, who closed the distance, who tried to engage at 200 yards and found themselves falling before they could fire a single shot. The German snipers were invisible. They were patient. They were absolutely lethal. Counter-sniper patrols went out and came back with nothing. Artillery observers tried to locate the hidden shooters and found nothing to target. The Germans had become part of the landscape itself, indistinguishable from the rubble they hid in, invisible to every tactic the Americans tried. The front line had stalled completely. Commanders watched their officers die faster than they could be replaced. The road to Carentan, so close on the map, might as well have been on the other side of the world. That was when Technical Sergeant Raymond Kozlowski stepped forward. He was a dairy farmer from Wisconsin, a man who had spent his life in and around concrete grain silos, climbing rusted ladders in absolute darkness, staying motionless for hours while watching nothing but grain and silence. He understood silos the way most men understood their own homes. He knew their strengths and their secrets. He knew that a concrete grain silo was nearly impossible to destroy, that its thick walls could stop rifle rounds, that its elevation provided a view that no hedgerow or ruined farmhouse could match. And he knew that the Germans, for all their tactical brilliance, had overlooked the agricultural infrastructure of Normandy entirely. They were looking for snipers in churches and barns. They were not looking for snipers in grain storage containers. Kozlowski found his silo on the edge of a destroyed farm, its concrete walls pocked with shrapnel damage, but still standing, still solid, still impossibly tall against the Normandy sky. The Germans had walked past it 100 times. Why would they bother? It was just a grain silo, an agricultural building, nothing to do with the war. They never considered that the very features that made it useful for storing grain, thick walls, elevated position, cylindrical shape that created dead space around it, made it the perfect sniper fortress. Kozlowski climbed to the top, found the access port, and cut a 12-inch hole in the concrete with tin snips he had carried since the landing. Through that hole, he could see the entire German defensive line. 37 positions, 14 officers identified by insignia and rank, a complete map of the enemy disposition spread out before him like a gift from God. He started hunting at 7:23 a.m. on June 18th. The first German officer fell at 7:24, the second at 7:31, the third at 7:47. Kozlowski took his time. He selected targets carefully, waited for the perfect moment, fired, and disappeared back into the darkness of the silo. The Germans had no idea where the shots were coming from. They searched hedgerows and found nothing. They searched ruined buildings and found nothing. They searched church towers and found nothing. They could not conceive that a sniper could be hidden inside a concrete grain storage container, that the agricultural infrastructure they had dismissed as irrelevant could be weaponized against them.
They assumed the shooter was concealed in hedgerows, rubble, or church steeples, the traditional sniper positions. They organized counter-sniper patrols and sent them into the places they expected to find an enemy. They found nothing. Meanwhile, Kozlowski kept shooting.
For 6 days, he killed 23 German officers. The German command structure in that sector began to dissolve. Radios went silent as the men who knew how to use them were picked off one by one. Officers refused to expose themselves to issue orders. The entire defensive line lost its coordination, its leadership, its ability to respond to American movements. The German snipers who had been so deadly just days before found themselves hunted instead of hunters, their traditional positions now death traps, as Kozlowski identified and eliminated them from his impossible vantage point. The Americans began to advance. The road to Carentan opened up. And somewhere in the chaos of the breakthrough, the Germans finally began to understand that they had been outsmarted by a dairy farmer who knew more about concrete silos than they knew about defensive warfare. By the end of 11 days, Kozlowski had killed 28 German officers. The exact number may never be known. Some kills were never confirmed, some bodies were never recovered. But 28 is the number that survived in the records, the number that the American commanders cited when they wrote their reports, the number that the surviving members of Kozlowski's unit remembered for the rest of their lives. Historians estimate that his work saved approximately 200 American lives. Those are the men who made it across that deadly field, who reached the hedgerows beyond, who fought their way to Carentan and beyond, because one man had looked at the Normandy countryside and seen what no one else could see. That sometimes the best sniper nest is the one nobody thinks to look in. The Germans eventually found the silo. They never discovered how many men had been inside it, or how long the sniper had been operating from that position. They found the 12-inch hole in the concrete, the brass casings scattered on the floor, the marks where a man had stood for hours in absolute darkness, waiting for his targets to appear. They searched the surrounding fields and found the American positions, understood at last how their defensive line had been mapped and destroyed. But by then, the Americans were already past Carentan, already pushing toward the heart of occupied France, already winning the battle that Kozlowski's silo had helped to turn. The war moved on. The Normandy hedgerows remained as deadly as ever. And somewhere in the records of the 90th Infantry Division, in the memories of the men who served with him, the name Raymond Kozlowski survived as the dairy farmer who turned agricultural experience into artillery. Kozlowski went home to Wisconsin after the war. He returned to his farm, to his dairy cattle, to the quiet life he had left behind when America called him to war. He did not talk about what he had done in Normandy. He did not give interviews or write memoirs or appear at veteran reunions to tell his story. The other men in his unit did the talking for him, passing the story down through the decades, ensuring that the dairy farmer from Wisconsin who had killed 28 German officers from inside a concrete silo would not be forgotten. The silo itself was probably destroyed in the fighting that followed. The hole he cut with his tin snips was probably filled with rubble as the battle moved past. The brass casings on the floor were probably collected by souvenir hunters or buried under the earth. But the story survived. It survived because it was true, because it mattered, because it showed what a single man could accomplish when he combined his unique experience with the needs of the moment. Today, the Normandy countryside looks different than it did in June 1944. The hedgerows have been cleared in places. The farm buildings have been rebuilt. The concrete silos still stand in some fields and have fallen to ruin in others. If you drive through that region, you might pass a silo that looks remarkably like the one Kozlowski used, cylindrical, concrete, tall against the sky,
utterly ordinary except for the knowledge of what it might have been. Most people who pass these silos have no idea what happened inside them during the summer of 1944. They see agricultural infrastructure, nothing more. They do not see the sniper position that killed 28 officers. They do not see the tactical innovation that saved 200 American lives. They do not see the dairy farmer from Wisconsin who changed the course of a battle by understanding something that professional soldiers had overlooked entirely.
That is the nature of agricultural innovation in war. It comes from men who know the land, who understand the built environment of farming, who can see the strategic value in structures that others dismiss as irrelevant. The Germans were brilliant tacticians. They had studied warfare for decades, had developed the most sophisticated military organization in the world, had conquered most of Europe through careful planning and ruthless execution. But they had not grown up climbing concrete silos in the American Midwest. They had not spent years working in darkness, staying motionless, watching and waiting. They had not learned to see agricultural infrastructure as anything other than what it appeared to be. And that blindness cost them 28 officers, a collapsed command structure, and a defensive position that should have held for weeks. Raymond Kozlowski did not consider himself a hero. He was a farmer who had been called to war, who had found a way to use his civilian experience on the battlefield, who had done his job and come home. The medals and the recognition went to other men. The story of the silo sniper nest survived in the memories of the men who were there, passed down through the decades, told in veterans clubs and historical societies, and now, finally, being told here. It is a story that deserves to be remembered because it shows what ordinary people can do when the circumstances demand innovation. It shows that the best weapons in war are not always the ones that are manufactured for that purpose. Sometimes the best weapons are the ones that already exist, waiting for someone with the right experience to see their potential.